Welcome to Principles of International Relations. In today's class, we will talk about the role of international organizations in the international system. So, as we remember from our last week's class, we focused on the role of conflict and cooperation and the irrationality of fighting wars. And so one of the outcomes which we got from this class was that there are certain factors, including asymmetric information, lack of trust, and indivisibility of goods, which hinder actors to find peaceful cooperation, even though it is in the interest of all the conflict parties. And so there is where the role of international organizations come in, and where they play a vital kind of aspect in our international system. Primarily, the focus in this class will be to understand these international organizations, their function, and kind of relate to different forms of theories about how important they are. And so we will kind of see this as a continuation of our understanding of conflict and cooperation, but extended in the way that helps us to get a fuller understanding of the international system and its key actors. So I hope you will enjoy this class, and I will go right into the slides. Thank you. Okay, here we are again. Thanks very much for listening to this class, and I want to kind of go right into the content of this class, providing you an outline with it. And the first thing I would like to tell you about is basically how do international institutions affect interaction between states. And how do they kind of lead to cooperation and prevent them from having conflict. So you remember in our last class we talked about the role of mediators and the importance of mediators in preventing conflict, and that's really important in this way to lead that conflicts don't lead to an escalation, and mediators have a key role. And one of these kind of mediators could be international organizations. However, we have different forms of international organizations, and I want to kind of throw two things together here. The multilateral international organizations, as you would see, the United Nations and others, and alliances, so security alliances between two different countries, or maybe many different countries, like you have in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so-called NATO. So I want to kind of look at these alliances and what kind of likelihood, the likelihood of war, kind of with this existing alliance, the existing alliances. Does it increase the likelihood of war? Does it decrease the likelihood of war? But there's also a general kind of question behind this, and that is the question is why states promise to fight someone else's war. Why would countries actually kind of make a decision that they will fight and a war for another country? And what's the logic behind him? And why is this logic challenged at times? And then in the last point, I really want to focus on international institutions and their role in providing collective security and promises of security for all countries. Well, if we kind of think about international institutions and war, we do have this kind of key aspect of anarchy of the states, where we basically see that that states, the anarchic system, the anarchic role of the international system is leading us to individual protection of individual states, and therefore the threat or the danger of conflict and violence. Some people would call this the question, where are the politics in world politics? Because essentially it's all about interests of individual states and not necessarily like a political decision making. Some people see that the role of international organizations are there to fill this void, this gap between the self-interest in an anarchic environment and kind of leading to kind of overall rules which international of fairness, cooperation, etc., which international institutions could provide. So in this way, we can see collective security organizations like the United Nations to facilitate collective action and to prevent the outbreak of violence. So we can see them in the chance of minimizing violence. In a way, military alliances, and I would go into details there a little later, but what an alliance really is, but this kind of organizations which are kind of align military action from different countries are kind of created when there are common interests in terms of or common security concerns, and it seems viable to cooperate militarily in order to kind of increase the security in this. So what we could see is that there is a military, like a security alliance between the United States and Japan, where at the one hand, the United States guarantees to defend Japan in case of a military attack. In return, and cooperate on any kind of a defense strategy closely. In return, they have the access to certain territory on military bases within Japan. We have one here in Fusa in Tokyo, but of course very well known are the military bases like the big ones in Okinawa, etc., which are where the U.S. military is able to station positions and kind of act from these kind of specific stations. So an alliance here really is the purpose of this alliance is to pool resources to increase security for both parties. The question we can ask, of course, about alliances is why would one country promise to fight a war for another country? And if we think about that countries are fighting wars for other countries, we really have to think about the motivation for this. So we have to see that there are a lot of costs involved or occur if you fight a war. And the benefit, of course, for the country might not be as great. So the really interesting part is not about whether countries are taking part in security alliances, because at that stage they don't necessarily need to commit a lot. They actually just need to say that they would agree to fight a conflict on the side of the other of the partner, but they don't need to kind of do it yet, and therefore they don't have the costs which occur. And so, in the same way, this is a very kind of tricky situation, because it should provide some insurance for a situation of an emergency, but there's no guarantee that actually the countries will follow through with this. This is especially kind of complicated in situations where we think about the possibility of nuclear war. So a country can give a security alliance to another country and say, like, if you get attacked, then we will kind of fight alongside with you as if we would be attacked ourselves. But is it really rational to kind of follow through with this? So it seems rational to kind of have this kind of alliances, because that strengthens the individual country is boosted by by the strength of the second country, and therefore it makes it the attempt for an attack is more costly for the other party. But at the same time, it's not kind of entirely clear whether the other party will follow through. So if we kind of think about the possibility of a nuclear war, this becomes very critical. But because which country would enter as a third party into a nuclear war where there is very high likelihood that they will be destroyed in the process of it? So, for example, the United States might give a security guarantee to Taiwan and kind of threaten China that it will attend or kind of fight along the side on the side of Taiwan in case of an attempt by the Chinese military to occupy Taiwan. But if there is a risk for an escalation into a full-out war between the United States and China, the question is really whether the United States will follow through with this. And because that would kind of lead to a very high level of potential costs, and therefore to a very high level of risk, which might be really difficult to explain to the American citizens that they would endure this risk to save an ally. This has been especially kind of been recognized in the situation of during the Cold War with European countries. So the United States gave within the framework of NATO gave security assurances to its European partners, especially West Germany. So in case any of the countries would be attacked by the Soviet Union, that it would actually kind of defend them, even explicitly kind of including the use of nuclear weapons. But again, this kind of security assurance works very well in terms of on the verbal basis. So if everything goes to plan, the Soviet Union would not attack Germany because it risks having a war with another nuclear power, but and therefore the price can never kind of can never exceed the costs of such a large conflict, and therefore there's always room for negotiations, how we kind of discussed in the last class. But if we kind of think about this in another way, once an attack would have happened, the United States would need to make the choice whether they really enter in a conflict like this, which then endangers American citizens greatly because of the threat of use of nuclear weapons against the country. And so we at that time, it might not be rational anymore for a U.S. president to really enter the war because the damage had been done and already, and the benefit or the risks are kind of very, very high at that stage. So in this situation, actually, a country might refrain from entering. And that becomes very problematic because if this is the case, then the first rhetoric statement is also not credible for the opposing party, and so they would expect actually that the alliance partner is not kind of taking part in the war altogether. One way the United States went around this and make it more credible, it is by making it an automatic response. So they didn't really kind of say that there needs to be a process in place where a decision is made whether the United States will act on behalf of one of their NATO partners, like Germany, but rather that there was an automatic process. So that if one of the countries is attacked by an alien force, this is seen as an automatic attack on all of the NATO members, and therefore they will, without kind of having individual decisions, they agree to respond immediately to this kind of threat by kind of bypassing this choice of or this individual choice of a country like the United States in a circumstance like this. They enable themselves to make their commitment much more credible, because now it seems very likely for the Soviet Union that the United States is actually kind of participating in the war and increasing the costs on both sides again. So one thing this example shows, is that alliances need to have a very high level of trust that excuse me, that the partner in an alliance is actually following through with their commitment in the alliance in case of a threat occurring to become real. So if this is not the case, the benefit of having an alliance is limited considerably, at least in avoiding military conflict. And so it is, this kind of trust level has to be kind of being very high. One of the reasons why lots of military personnel as well as allies of the United States have been so critical of early statements of President Trump, that he would make it a conditional to support its allies in East Asia, like Japan and South Korea, in case of a military attack. The reason for this was really because lots of experts thought that this would undermine the trust in the alliance, and therefore kind of increasing the risk of possible violations of this kind of alliances. So we can see that this at least partly had an effect, because China nowadays more openly ponders upon the possibility of taking Taiwan by force and questioning the commitment of the United States by really defending the island. And so in this way, maybe we can already observe a lack of trust in the alliance with the United States. So the two key factors for take away from this is that alliance are great, security alliance are great tools to increase the costs of the potential costs of conflict, and therefore decrease the risk of conflict to occur, or military conflict to occur. At the same time, they only work if the commitment level is really high. Otherwise, they are not sufficient. Just this is a side note. You don't need to necessarily remember this, but the kind of mechanism how alliances, security alliances work, hasn't been fully understood until the end of the Second World War. And in the interwar period between the First World War and the Second World War, a lot of countries in Europe especially fostered certain secret security alliances with other states, where they kind of negotiated with them in secret that they will participate in conflict with them. Some of them actually had been conflicting with each other. For example, Russia, the Soviet Union provided a security alliance for Germany, with Germany, as well as with the United Kingdom, and But the fact that these kind of security alliances have been in secret made it problematic, because the commitment once conflict broke out was of course very limited, and we could see that they faltered very quickly. The war started, and to the surprise of actually many of the state actors, commitments were easily broken if they had been kind of coded in secret. So an important aspect is that they are public, and an important aspect really is that this commitment is seen by the opponent rather than just kind of the word by the or the agreement between the individual countries. So if we kind of think about alliances and alignments, uh, they basically are kind of spun upon from at least two countries. So it can be two, but it can also be multiple countries. So I talked of the security alliance between Japan and the United States. This is a security alliance which is essentially based on the bilateral cooperation between the two countries, and is very close in its ties, but doesn't include any other actors in any formal sense. At the same time, organizations like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NATO, is an alliance with multiple partners who are all kind of responsible to each other. And these kind of organizations then provide an alliance which is, of course, more complex, but also depends on more variable factors, which increase the institutional structure, which is necessary, but also increase the risk of failure if one or several partners within the alliance have different opinions on certain issues. One thing how alliances have been seen during the Cold War is seen as a great tool to create or preserve a balance of power. So in a way, alliances can lead to go beyond the power balance of individual states and create an increase basically the group sizes, and therefore kind of balance out power within the international system. There are several ways of thinking about this. One is the idea about bandwagoning. So that's a strategy for a weaker state to follow the strongest state in order to be secured. So, for example, you could see this in the situation of Germany after the Second World War. Many European countries, including Italy, and others after the Second World War, but also Japan, South Korea, etc. All are kind of following the most powerful actor of the time, the United States, and bandwagon behind their kind of security shield. Another thing is a mechanism which we can observe is the idea of balancing, and that means that countries are kind of eager not to have one very dominant power, but rather hegemonic power, but rather kind of a balance between several ones. And so what we saw with the Soviet Union and the competition of the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, is that we had two of these kind of security multilateral security arrangements. The US side, the NATO, as I mentioned before, at the Soviet Union side, the Warsaw Pact, which was quite similar from the Eastern Bloc to the NATO, which then created an institution which helped to balance out the power structure between the US and the Soviet Union by adding additional countries to it. Oops. So if we kind of think about the idea about balancing of power in alliances, it doesn't necessarily account for all the decisions within the alliance. Especially
what it does not explain is why some partners are more desirable than others. In a way, we should actually kind of see that if balancing is the key feature of a security alliance, then we would it would be indiscriminative of what countries are kind of joining an alliance and only focused on the idea that the balance exists. But as I mentioned before, one of the key aspects of alliances is this high level of trust and the high level of a commitment to follow through with the common goals of the alliance rather than kind of looking at the individual goals, and that is something which is more difficult in with certain countries than others. So what we do find is that alliances very often are along cleavages of ideological kind of preferences. So during the Cold War, we did have the alliances of more Western liberal, maybe if you want to, capitalist kind of systems, and on the Eastern more socialist kind of systems, which supported each other. So the key reason for this is the increased level of trust of systems which are similar to your own ones. The same thing is also true that not all strong powers are really kind of provoking this idea of balancing, while at times we do have a dominance of the idea of bandwagoning. So what we have seen during, for example, during the British Empire in the 19th century, is that we didn't find any kind of counterbalancing of the power of the British Empire, but rather an effect of bandwagoning, where most powers tried to kind of bandwagon its security behind the United Kingdom. If you think about alliances and interstate bargaining from a theoretical perspective, we can use this kind of scheme what we have here. So what we do see is this. What we do see here is that basically the kind of the conflictual bargaining which we discussed in our last class, and what we can easily see here is that the power structure of actor A versus actor B is kind of heavily influenced by this kind of third-party state, which brings in their own kind of power contribution, and therefore makes it harder. We can shift the conflictual situation into favor of actor A. One interesting part is that most security alliances are actually defense alliances. Very few security alliances are including offensive wars. So what I mean by that is that countries, if countries want to, let's say, invade, reclaim territory, any kind of aggressive, deemed as aggressive act towards another actor, most security alliances don't include these kind of actions. So the NATO, for example, is protecting any country within in NATO being attacked by an outside country, would deem this attack to be against all NATO members, and all will respond. But in recent years, what we did have is that Turkey, a member of NATO, had a military conflict with the Kurdish parts in Iraq and the Kurdish parts in Syria, where they tried to gain control over certain territory in Syria and in Iraq, and it did it by force. But NATO did not intervene in this conflict. Actually, NATO strongly opposed against the actions by Turkey, and threatened with sanctions if they would continue with this kind of conflict. But the security alliance generally doesn't include any kind of offensive wars, but only kind of on the defensive side.
So what we can see on this graph below is really that if we take X as the possible outcome between a war of actor A and actor B, we can see that C is strengthening the position of actor A in kind of reducing the probability of losing any kind of territory to actor B, but at the same time it doesn't really increase the chance of gaining any territory for actor B. So generally seen, security alliances make the international system more stable because they increase the costs of an attack by an actor outside of the alliance, but they don't necessarily encourage actors within the alliance to be more offensive. So if you kind of think about this back with the graphs what we had before, in our last class, we do have on the very left-hand side actor A and on the very right-hand side actor B. The further it goes to the left, actor B becomes more dominant. The further it goes to the right, actor A gets more from the division of the good, be it territory or whatever. And of course, we have in green the so-called bargaining range. The bargaining range gives the probability of an outcome of a war plus the costs for it. So what we do have here is that if another actor with maybe, let's say, equal strength or even stronger is included in this kind of conflict, it boosts the side of actor A, makes the status quo of actor A much stronger. The bargaining range, therefore, is kind of shifted to the right, and the status quo of actor B is becoming much smaller. Therefore, it actually reduces the possibility of conflict because actor A will have more would have a much higher probability of gaining grounds in a military conflict, and therefore incentives for actor B to change the positioning are kind of diminished. But as I mentioned before, what is really important is the signal of being credible and willing to live up to the obligations of the security alliance. So we must an alliance must have some mechanism which makes it likely that countries are following suit in the case of a conflict. If this is not the case, that they can't make it credible that they will fight on the side of their alliance partner, it kind of puts the credibility of the whole system into question, and therefore might lead to an opponent which discards the willingness of the alliance to stand together. And that is very important in kind of the decision making of an opponent to maybe risk a military conflict. So even it is not only important that actually once a conflict happens that the countries stand by, but it's also really important that they are kind of signaling this beforehand and making it clear to the opponents that they will act in a certain way. This kind of asymmetric information could lead to conflicts occur, and even if the willingness is existent, to kind of lead to a military conflict. To show you a failure where this existed was in a kind of the first Iraq war. So Kuwait had a military alliance, an informal at least military alliance with the United States. And it's the United States that it would defend Kuwait from any military action by Iraq. But Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq at that time, did not kind of see this commitment as credible. they thought, and might have even got some signals out of the U.S. administration, the Bush administration at the time, that they will not intervene. So they thought that they could invade Kuwait without the risk of the US getting involved. Of course, this was a misjudgment, and what we know afterwards, this was the start of the first Iraq War, where Iraq heavily lost. If it would have been well understood by Saddam Hussein that the United States will act on behalf of Kuwait in a case of a military confrontation, it would have been very likely that he actually did not decide to invade Kuwait. But a kind of a failure in this situation kind of led to this military conflict. So it is. This shows again that it's really important to communicate security alliances, not internally only, but also externally, and show that this commitment is strong. Some things like formal procedures or procedures which do not include political decisions can be very influential in kind of making security alliances credible. If you kind of think about two of the key multilateral alliances, we can think about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. On the one hand, the NATO, as I mentioned a couple of times here as well, so which basically includes the United States, Canada, and most of Western European countries, including Turkey, and the Warsaw Pact, which included most Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union. At the end of the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact has been dissolved, and they both started as opposing security alliances between the East and the West. But NATO has survived this situation and became now a very influential security alliance of the West altogether, with even not only including challenges by Russia, the predecessor of the Soviet Union, but the successor of the Soviet Union, but rather also kind of or any other security threats towards North America or Europe. Interestingly, the only time when the NATO formally was invoked, the alliance, security alliance was formally invoked, was after an attack on the United States. That was the attack, the 9/11, a terrorist attack, which was formally involved. The NATO was formally used, and the procedures were taking place in order to start military procedures against Afghanistan, in this case, where lots of Al-Qaeda terrorists have been harbored at the time. And so we actually found that in Afghanistan, NATO troops from almost all NATO members have been active. And yeah, but it has never been invoked another time, or before or after. Security alliances, collective security organizations are often seen as organizations which have permanent institutions for peace and security. So these institutions are kind of standing body of organization, etc. But they're not necessarily kind of efficient in reducing conflict. They might actually kind of be helpful in escalating conflict, but not necessarily in preventing it altogether. So the idea of international organizations is has been born after the end of the Second World War, was really to kind of find a forum for mediation of conflict between different parts of the world and different kind of groups, not just kind of friends between each other, but rather kind of different groups, and that is really important from different for different reasons. Organizations like the League of Nations were born after the First World War, and the idea here was that we can really kind of mediate conflict in an efficient way between conflicting partners, rather than kind of creating only alliances of like-minded countries to protect themselves. The League of Nations, as we have discussed in an earlier class, was not really successful. It was kind of proctored by and supported heavily by the United States as an alliance and like an international forum. And it came, but the real problem of it was that it came in place without the United States, because the Senate in the US and the presidency, Woodrow Wilson, did not support the organization, and so the US could not join it, and therefore the biggest power in the world at the time was not member of it, and that was kind of seen as problematic for the organization, and so it never came into place. Of course, we know that its successor, the United Nations, which came into place after the end of the Second World War, is much more successful. We can see many reasons for this. One about it having a less egalitarian kind of structure by creating a Security Council of the most powerful countries. This was, of course, seen as a benefit, making it more attractive for very powerful countries to actually participate. But until now, this has been the probably dominant international organizations in order to kind of proctor peace in the world. There are lots of problems with it, and we will discuss them in more detail just in a minute. But generally seen, it existed for a very long time. It hence has lots of other organizations below it, which are really important, and we can see that in with all its limitations, it has been kind of seen as a success. It has been seen as a success. Why would we need this kind of collective security organization? In a way, we can see it as an opposition of a security alliance. So a security alliance works where states have common interests, and of course are in bargaining situations, conflictual maybe bargaining situations with adversaries. In these situations, security alliances are very good because they help to strengthen the position of a specific actor, and they help at the same time to kind of keep a situation maybe not non-conflictual, but help from escalating the conflict. Collective security organizations don't include only friendly nations, but all states. And that is really important, because then they can kind of the idea here is to foster mechanisms which prevent wars altogether. So by kind of being a mediator in the process of conflict between states, these organizations are helpful in order to overcome conflictual situations without kind of having even the threat of use of force in it. However, they are not kind of there to alter the outcome, the bargaining outcome in the way to one side or the other, but rather kind of with one hand to kind of keep the status quo, or finding an orderly way to change the status quo in a way which is agreeable with all the sides. So if we kind of think about our fear and bargaining model, kind of keeping it in the bargaining range, and therefore as a mediator ensuring that both sides will not that it will not lead to a military conflict. So we can, of course, ask ourselves, so how does this kind of collective security work? When there's a threat to the international peace from one party or another, we can see that that the United Nations can kind of take a position, so all on the conflict, and kind of which leads to different measures for kind of trying to convince one or both of the parties to change their positions. One way to do this is by supplying economic sanctions. And this is a maybe relatively mild way of dealing with issues. We can see this in the case of North Korea. So the general idea is that in order to change or to unincentivize North Korea from having nuclear weapons, the international system wants to kind of impose sanctions on North Korea to change their opinion, their position. So this kind of creates costs, and cost in two ways: cost for the first part, and cost for the other side. And the ideas of these costs are that it kind of changes the perception of the one side and kind of alters their positions to a more favorable position of the international community. However, this is just one way to deal with problems in the international system. It can kind of, economic sanctions have different levels of scale, and it can go up to a military intervention led by forces provided to the United Nations. So the idea, of course, of these interventions is to foster peaceful conflict resolution. What we do see very more frequently is an intervention on behalf of the citizens, often called like a humanitarian intervention, if there is a real kind of threat for genocide and other kind of conflicts, which are kind of threatening the livelihood of parts of the population. Having said that, there are kind of certain limitations, which are especially kind of grounded in the idea of this so-called Security Council. So this is the body which is the most powerful body within the United Nations, and there are the so-called P5 members. So these are the permanent five members, which are always member of the Security Council. This is the United States, France, the UK, Russia, as the successor of the Soviet Union, and China. These five members are always sitting in the Security Council, and they have a specific right, and that means a veto right. So any kind of decision which they don't like, they can veto, and then it will not be taken, it will not be kind of adopted by the United Nations. So this kind of unequal power structure is really important, because the United Nations is not necessarily is not able to act against any of these P5 members, or even a close ally of these P5 members, if the member agrees not to kind of veto any kind of UN action. So in this way, even in humanitarian interventions, the hands of the United Nations are very frequently tied, and we see this in in countless conflicts. We can see this in the Syrian conflict, We can see this in the Palestinian conflict. We can see this also in situations which are seen humanitarianly critical, like the treatment of China and with its Uyghur community, or the treatment earlier on of China in the case of Tibet, etc. So we do see this in many kind of conflicts. In a way, this kind of, but before we kind of talk about the limitations of the United Nations, maybe we should kind of emphasize first the positive role. And I think we can see here three kind of key roles which the United Nations can have, and which are really important in resolving conflict. First of all, it's maybe the most obvious, like outside involvement makes wars less attractive by changing the likelihood of the outcome. So if you start a conflict, a military conflict as one actor, and there's a likelihood that the United Nations is kind of imposing either economic sanctions or intervention, that will change the outcome of the conflict, and therefore make it less attractive to actually start conflicts. So it's not only, we should, when we kind of look at the importance of the United Nations, we should not only look at what they do in specific conflicts, but also think about how they prevent some conflicts to happen. And so maybe we don't even, because of the United Nations, we might not see some kind of conflictual situations to escalate to real military conflicts, even if they would without the existence of the United Nations. Another issue which is really helpful is that the United Nations can provide a commitment mechanism, or it can resolve commitment problems. So if the United Nations act as a mediator between the conflicting parties, they can make sure, for example, that they monitor certain agreements which are done between parties, and kind of make sure that they are enforced for a long run. We had this kind of commitment issues in our last class when we talked about that we need to understand like the shadow of the future. So maybe one agreement in a conflictual negotiations at the time now might not take place because countries are worried that in the future there will be additional kind of conflict occur, and maybe change the power structure already now. So in a way, the United Nations can provide commitment in these kind of situations that it will not be kind of tolerated by the international community to renegotiate outcomes at a later stage. Another form of commitment can be in terms of monitoring outcomes. So the United Nations can kind of have observers which are monitoring, for example, the limitations of weapon production, etc., and go into the countries as neutral forces, observers, and can observe situations, and they can also be there as peacekeepers in order to kind of mediate between conflicting parties, to make sure that violence is not breaking out. So the two key functions which we see here is that as a mediator, the United Nations can make sure that agreements are kind of stick to, and make sure that conflicting parties are kept apart, etc. But as an actor, they can also make it less attractive to start a conflict in the first place. But there are also certain problems with this kind of collective action, and I want to kind of focus on two, which are called the collective action problem and the joint decision-making problem. The collective action problem is issue which is often seen as a free rider problem, which lead to low levels of cooperation. So within this, in the United Nations, maybe certain actors are not willing to endure costs, because not because they're not kind of supporting the goals, but rather they would like to kind of bear other countries to take the costs of a certain action. And so what we do find is that commitment levels to proctor peace, but also to kind of to stick to regular rules of the United Nations is relatively low. And these kind of low levels are kind of hampering the efforts of the United Nations. The joint decision-making problem is that, of course, with organizations of the size of the United Nations, decision-making process can be, first of all, very slow, and then because of the specific structure of the Security Council, they can be very limiting. So a lot of areas where maybe it would be necessary to have an independent mediator who is kind of mediating conflict, it doesn't exist. Why? Because one or several of the actors have a vested interest in this conflict to continue, and might use their veto power. So to give you a concrete example, we could think about the Syrian conflict, which was going on for many, many years, and the United Nations basically played no crucial role in this conflict at all. Why? Because the Syrian leader Assad is a close ally of the Russian leader Putin, and so Russia was blocking any kind of attempts to proctor peace in the conflict within the Security Council. So the power Russia has with its veto power kind of enabled it to block any kind of efforts to create peace in this region, and therefore led for the conflict to be prolonged in a way. But this kind of Syrian conflict is not an exception. Many kind of conflicts in the world are having certain constellation that the conflicting party is affiliated with one of the veto powers, and therefore the United Nations is not able to act efficiently in these kind of situations. So if we think about the Security Council, so this is the highest body within the United Nations. There are the General Assembly, of course, which is kind of including all the members, but the Security Council is only including 15 members. And then there are the 5 permanent members, which I mentioned before. This is the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. They are constantly sitting in this highest level of the United Nations. There are also 10 non-permanent members, and they are on a rotating basis in the Security Council. And they are voting as well on decisions in the Security Council. But unlike the permanent 5 members, they don't have a veto power. That means that they cannot unilaterally block any kind of decisions by the Security Council. So they are working with a majority in the Security Council, and therefore are much less powerful. But still, they are quite powerful, more powerful than other countries which are not members of the Security Council at the time. But this kind of stringent, especially the P5 members, this kind of stringent constraints that they can veto situations is very critical for having situations where the United Nations might want to act, might be possible to kind of act positively, but is not able of getting the kind of decisions through. If we kind of think about the United Nations, where do we need this kind of Security Council approval? It's in many issues, but the 2 of the most notables are the kind of peace enforcement and peacekeeping. The difference is peace enforcement is a more active part, where actually the United Nations military
under the umbrella of the United Nations. So the United Nations doesn't have an own military force, but it can, its members can delegate their military towards actions of the United Nations. So they are basically providing the military force towards the United Nations authorities. But in this way, they can actually kind of act, actively act, and intervene in conflicts. Peacekeeping is a different idea, where the United Nations is trying to keep different conflicting parties apart, and kind of maybe creating buffer zones, etc., to kind of reduce the risk of military action between different parties. If you kind of think about the United Nations in the current world war, we can current situation, we can maybe I want to kind of use two older conflicts to visualize the specific kind of strengths and weaknesses. So during the Gulf War, what we in this with the Iraq War, what we have seen is that after the end of the Cold War, the UN was really seeing new possibilities, and many resolutions. So 12 resolutions have been passed by the United Nations to use all necessary means to end the conflict, and 35 nations actually participated. So in this way, it was a kind of a widespread conflict in ending the conflict under the degree of the United Nations. At the same time, we can think about the Yugoslavian war, especially the Bosnian war, within this kind of framework. And we see that Bosnia-Herzegovina, the civil war, it spread 3 years, and 300,000 people have been killed, 200 have been refugeed. So it's a very large scale conflict within Europe, but the United Nations did not find an agreement to act in this conflict, and therefore lots of lives have been lost, and it has been seen as a real weak point of the security structure by the United Nations, because it showed the inability to act in this specific conflict. An even more kind of striking example is the case of Rwanda, Rwandan genocide, where we did have a deployment of the United Nations, and in this case, of course, we know this is one of the worst genocides in the world. Millions of people in Rwanda died. Civilians died by more or less only being slaughtered. And the interesting situation there was that peacekeeping forces were in place, but did not really have the opportunity or the right to actively enforce a peace. So what was really seen as the ultimate failure of the case of Rwanda was that there was a peacekeeping mission in place, but at the time, the United Nations was not equipped to actually kind of keep this peace forcefully. And so if it has, in this case, it has been ignored by the fighting parties. And what happened at the end was that basically this led to a situation where the peacekeeping forces were completely inefficient and could not prevent the genocide to happen. And that was, of course, seen as a major failure of the United Nations peacekeeping forces, because what is the point of having these kind of forces when they are not kind of functioning in a way that they keep the peace which they are supposed to do. So in this way, it was really kind of seen as a eureka moment where the limitations of these kind of peacekeeping
forces became very obvious, and it basically and this situation ended in a failure. Having said that, it's not the only situation like this within within the Bosnian conflict, which I mentioned before as another failure of the United Nations. We can also see that there was a city which was seen as a safe haven, Srebrenica, which was seen as a safe haven and was supposed to be protected by the United Nations, but the Serbian forces decided to take it by force, and that led to a situation where the UN peacekeeping forces needed to retrieve and left the people in their vulnerable and even in a situation like they have been entrapped, which also has to be seen very critical of the function of the United Nations. While these kind of limitations are still partly existent and really important to assess, the United Nations have improved since then. And now there are functions in place which prevent or should prevent these events to reoccur. But one of the really obvious problems is still existent, and that is that unlike a military force by a nation, the command structure for the United Nations is very slow and very much changing. And as international forces, the idea, of course, is that it is not like a party in a military conflict, just rather a mediator. And it is reliant on the acceptance of this function. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult for the organization to keep the peace. We can discuss this case and others, of course, continue to discuss this in class. But I would like to make a short summary of the role of international institutions and alliances. So in a way, international institutions can prevent and stop wars from by being effective mediators. Alliances often seem to work better in among allies in order to make sure that that the power structure is either balanced, or at least that an individual country has some form of protection by a stronger member. What is really important in terms of alliances is to ensure that the commitment to stand up for an alliance partner is really existent, and how this is implemented. And collective security is most effective only when there is a strong agreement among the most powerful states to enforce this collective agreement. And so, especially in the structure of the United Nations, the decision-making process by the permanent members of the Security Council, the P5, is as essence for the UN to function, and very frequently we do see that this is not the case, and then conflicting positions of the P5 members lead to ineffective actions or no actions of the United Nations at all. So in a way, both can be seen as an imperfect constellation for keeping peace on a global stage. So we cannot see them as functioning, neither of them as functioning as a world police. This is a situation which is basically not existent, at least in the current structure of the international system. We can't see this. Whether this can be achieved in the future at some point is open for debate. Some scholars would say, no, this is against the general structure of the international system, while others would maybe argue that with the right settings of international law, we could achieve a situation like this. But what is definitely true is that until now, we don't have a situation like this. So it is really important to keep in mind that the the importance of the functions of international institutions and alliances, they are having a vital role in keeping peace and preventing military actions to happen, but they are not a tool for or a solution for all forms of conflict, and are having their limitations as well. So I hope we can kind of continue these kind of issues in our class, and I look forward to seeing you all in our meeting. Until then, take care and goodbye. Bye-bye.